Okay, so let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session Toolkits for Sustainable Development Goals. My name is Arji Cavada, and I'm the Executive Director of the Earth Observations for Sustainable Development Goals Initiative, or EO for SDG. And I have the pleasure today to be co-moderating this session with Laurent Duvier, who recently joined the GEO Secretariat as the coordinator for Sustainable Development Goals. So we're very excited to have him join our work and community. So we have a terrific panel with us today, comprised of Emily Smale from NOAA and the Geo Blue Planet Initiative, Mike Gill from Nature Serves Biodiversity Indicators Program and the Geo Bond Flagship, Heiko Balster from the University of Leicester, Derek Vollmer from Conservation International, and Dilek Frizel from YASA and the Citizen Science Activity from GEO. And so our session today is a Toolkits pitch fest. So you will hear from our panelists about their ideas about developing an Earth observations toolkit focused on a specific sustainable development goal or goals, or a toolkit that relates to an activity from the GEO work program with links to the SDGs. And so toolkits are really meant to help stakeholders use Earth observations to advance the SDGs. And just for a bit of a background, in 2020, the EO for SDG initiative piloted the first toolkit working collaboratively with the many contributors from the GEO community, as well as the UN Human Settlements Program, UN Habitat, and a number of partners from cities, national governments, non-governmental organizations, private sector, and others to develop this online knowledge resource that helps provide relevant data, tools, training resources, as well as use cases on a number of topics around adequate housing, open spaces, urbanization, and public transport. So I do invite you to look at that toolkit online. You see the link right there. And so today there is a chance for our panelists here to share their perspectives and ideas about the next EO toolkit. We actually put out a call for this session and we received a great number of responses. And so today we have the first number of colleagues presenting their ideas, and we're organizing a following session next week on June 30th at 1 p.m. Central European time to hear from additional colleagues on their ideas. So please make sure we'll advertise that additional session and make sure to join that session as well. So now, without further ado, I will pass it over to our first speaker. But before I do so, I do want to invite you to add your questions or comments using the chat. We're going to look at those questions, and I will also invite our panelists to try and respond to some of this in written format, but we will also aim to have some time at the end of the session for Q&A. In addition, Laurent will be tracking time, so he will be giving you a friendly warning at 1 minute before your time is up. And so with that, let me turn it over to our first speaker, Emily Smale. Emily.
Thank you, RG. So today I'm going to give a presentation about an idea for a toolkit around the UN Decade of Ocean Science. Next slide. So for some background, the UN Decade of Ocean Science was proclaimed by the United Nations for 2021 to 2030. And with this effort, which is led by the International Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO, there's really a hope that around the world we can get nations together to work on information related to the ocean that can support sustainable development. Next slide. And for the SDGs and the ocean, there is a SDG that is specific to the ocean called Life Below Water, SDG 14. But as you'll see, a lot of the other SDGs are very tied in with the ocean, and particularly with the decade goals that they have, including a clean ocean, healthy and resilient ocean, productive ocean. Next slide. safe ocean and accessible ocean. Next slide. And then there also is one on an inspiring and engaging ocean that would focus on, you know, a lot of the partnerships and other issues. Next slide. And for the toolkit, we would propose to focus on SDG 14 and provide linkages to other information that are relevant to related SDGs. And I've highlighted in red here some of the SDG 14 targets that require Earth observation information. So those include reducing marine pollution, protecting and restoring ecosystems, reducing ocean acidification, and increasing scientific knowledge, research, and technology for ocean health. I'll add that a lot of these, in order to be achieved, do require action from interdisciplinary and land-sea activities. So, for example, if you're looking at marine pollution, a lot of the coastal pollution due to nutrients, so eutrophication is caused by land-based activities from, you know, fertilizer outputs and other drivers, as well as marine litter is you know, primarily driven by litter that enters the sea from land. So really integrating across communities would really be important for this toolkit. Next slide. And next, I'll highlight some existing products that have been made related to some of the SDGs. And one thing that a toolkit would really help with would be to bring together a lot of these data products that have been produced and are continuing to be produced by different communities. The custodian agencies for the targets vary, and we have heard feedback from some stakeholders that it would be helpful to have everything in one spot. So for example, if you're looking to submit information or look for information on eutrophication, we've been working with UN Environment as well as partnering with ESRI, and they also are working with the Regional Seas programs and the Global Ocean Observing System. UN Environment also has a global partnership on marine litter that is looking to support SDG 14.1 as well. And they are putting together a global partnership on marine litter that's a digital platform. And this is something that was mandated out of one of the UN Environment General Assemblies. Next slide. For other indicators, the Marine Biodiversity Observation Network, in collaboration with some other partners, have also produced a product that looks at biodiversity records as well as some satellite-derived biogeography to try to predict different types of ecosystems and where they are, and link that to biodiversity. And so this is something that is being developed for the indicator on protecting and restoring ecosystems. Next slide. For the Ocean Acidification Network, there is a global community who addresses ocean acidification called the Global Ocean Acidification Observing Network. Their acronym is GOON. And they have put together an online platform that has information about data. So you can actually submit data to the platform, but they also have capacity development information. And there are other activities such as collaborations with the Ocean Foundation on doing training and tech transfer for ocean acidification. And so that information is in the process of being collected and distributed. Next slide. And then lastly, as an example, IOC UNESCO has this Ocean Teacher Global Academy where they are collecting information related to trainings. And this would be something that could be beneficially linked to an SDG toolkit. And the benefit we see for linking all these together is just making it easier for communities to communicate. Right now, people are going to different platforms and struggling to find all of the relevant websites that are coming out. Next slide. For the target audience, we would be looking at trying to support national environmental and statistical agencies So we have heard from some of the statistic agencies as well as some of the regional scientists that they, hear through the grapevine that some of these products exist, but they don't know where to find them, if they're up to date, if they're going to continue. And so that would really help them, as well as, having information that would support the private sector, NGOs, other government agencies, and academic sectors. Next slide. In terms of key contributors, this would need a broad partnership. So from the GEO side, the contributions would be led by GEO Blue Planet and the Marine Biodiversity Observation Network. But having contributions from other activities, such as UN Habitat when it comes to marine litter, working with GeoGlam on agriculture related to eutrophication, things of that sort would be really important, as well as a lot of the UN agencies and other international activities that we have been partnering with. Next slide. And one thing that we would hope this would achieve is SDG 14 is lagging behind some of the other SDGs. A lot of that is due to countries having limited capacity to collect and distribute ocean data. So by having information about how to collect and share the data readily available, we think that that would help move forward progress on SDGs and also allow us to try to make connections with the other SDGs so that people aren't doing everything in silos. And we'd also be hoping to co-design ocean and coastal products that could be used for decision making, working closely with end users, as we've seen some of the countries. So I was just talking recently to some UN Environment colleagues in Latin America who are saying that the countries really want to be producing their own data, even if they're using global data products. They want to know how it's processed. So we think it'd be really important to help other countries process the information themselves so that they're more comfortable with it. Next slide.
1 minute, Emily, thank you.
And in terms of resources, we would be looking for some digital infrastructure, some savvy programmers, as well as buy-in from the ocean community. As I've noted, there are a lot of great initiatives already ongoing that we could link to, as well as general graphic design support. And we'd really like to work with GEO to try to get a lot of information that wouldn't just be limited to ocean information into the toolkit as well. And any technical coordination and support that we could get from the GEO Secretariat and EO for SDG initiative. Next slide. And that's all I have. And thank you very much for the opportunity to pitch our toolkit, RG.
Thank you very much, Emily. So questions for Emily, please include them in the chat. Emily can try to answer them in written format, but she will also have an opportunity at the end to provide verbal responses. Let's go to Mike next. Mike Gill, over to you.
Thanks, Argy. And my name is Mike Gill, and I'm the director of the Biodiversity Indicators Program at NatureServe. Thanks very much for the opportunity to make this pitch. I make it on behalf of not just NatureServe, but also 3 of our pilot country institutions in South Africa, Bahamas, and Peru, as well as with our partners at ESRI. So next slide, please. So I'll start just by framing the urgency of the issue. No surprise to anyone here, but we're in the 6th extinction crisis, and it's accelerating despite the efforts of the last 10 years to halt and even reverse biodiversity decline. We've seen that we failed to reach all of the 20 ACHI biodiversity targets. And failing to reach biodiversity targets isn't just have repercussions on nature itself, but actually underpins all SDGs. So if we want to meet our sustainable development goals, we actually have to meet our biodiversity targets. Next slide, please. And so what's happened, of course, and quite rightly, is the world's responded to the crisis by initiating a number of multilateral environmental agreements and initiatives under the UN, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Sustainable Development Goals. Each one of those comes with their own goals and targets and reporting commitments. The Sustainable Development Goals come with 169 targets. And countries really struggle, both developed and developing, to really keep up with this reporting burden. So our challenge here is really, how do we actually streamline and lower the threshold for more efficient and interoperable indicator reporting systems? Next slide. And you would think that since we are in the age of big data, everyone always talks about 90% of all data generated in the last 2 years. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but I think we can all agree we have a lot of data, especially from Earth observation satellites overhead. But the paradox is that that incredible increase in data is not translating into actual effective and targeted use. And through the April's Global Science for Biodiversity Forum, we actually asked the global audience, what are your biggest barriers? And 92% selected lack of capacity for target tracking and reporting. So countries around the world really struggle to actually leverage and make use of EO data as well as their own data to make some intelligent decisions and go from a paper pushing exercise to actually some actionable conservation, sustainable development. But the thing is the opportunities are in front of us. We've made major advances in GeoBond on data access and standards and analytics, workflows and visualizations, such as through partners such as Esri. And we have networks in place through GEO to actually accelerate technology and best practices transfer. And we're actually already doing this. So we're building toolkits with a number of countries around the world, we being NatureServe and Esri. And these are really serving as incubators where we can actually prove the viability for a simple but powerful process. And finally, later this year, we should see the adoption of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And everyone is calling for increased national capacity building. Everyone's clamoring for it. That's the biggest reason for the failure in the last 10 years is we haven't equipped those on the front lines to actually respond to the crisis. Next slide. So the approach that we take is one where we actually build user-driven and repeatable and customizable indicator reporting systems. What we do is we follow a structured workflow approach where we work directly with the nation to co-develop these systems. We ask, what are the sustainable development goals of key interest to you, the biodiversity targets, the national development targets that you need to actually track and report on? And then what are the sort of data products that you need to actually inform good conservation, sustainable development policy? We then unpack those using essential biodiversity variables and other frameworks to actually build repeatable circular workflows that say who brings what data, when, how do we mix that data together to produce the outputs that we need. Next slide, please. And this is actually just an example of it in action. So this is through our partners at the South African National Biodiversity Institute, who lead on our spatial biodiversity assessments. And this system is simple, but beautiful and powerful in that we're really talking about just some core data ingredients like protected areas, land cover time series, land use and vegetation maps. And you can actually recombine those in different ways to produce spatial biodiversity assessments, biodiversity targets, SDG target indicators, environmental screening, and even natural capital accounts. And the idea is these are just fancy words for recipes. We're building cookbooks where we're trying to embed the concept that this does not have to be that hard. You just need to keep a few core ingredients, just like you do in your kitchen: flour, sugar, water, eggs, milk. You can build a cake, you can make a muffin. The same goes for biodiversity data. How do we actually discover and strengthen national and global data holdings to produce multiple policy outputs? Next slide, please. And so we're really just going from this on the left, where you've just got a collection of tools, lots of great tools out there, but confusion about how to use them and in what sequence, to a nice, clean, shiny toolkit where we actually work with nations to come up with the best tools and practices to build these sustainable reporting systems. Next slide. So this is just an example of some of the outputs to date. This is where we've deployed this approach in Uganda, where we've been able to conduct these spatial biodiversity assessments for the entire country. And these are being used not just for prioritizing conservation and restoration activities, they're also updating their natural capital accounts on land and in water. Next slide, please. And we're also deploying this through the use of Esri ArcGIS-based dashboards that bring to life not only national but global data holdings in dashboard formats so that we can actually help statistics offices and Ministry of Environments and others be able to actually track in real time distance and progress towards target. Next slide. So what's inside the toolbox? Well, we're really just talking about building digital national biodiversity tracking toolkits that are structured around these workflows. Inside of them, we bring together data mapping and analytic tools, as well as our dashboards. We have dashboards in development in Southeast Asia, the tropical Andes, and the Arctic right now, with many others coming into play. And we have a number of use case examples that we work with that are backed up with technical documentation, training modules, data libraries, and a support center. We're really looking to GEO to come on as a partner in this to sort of strengthen that process and to upscale this around the world. Next slide, please.
Mike, 1 minute, please.
Okay. So who needs this? Well, we're working with the core users in the national statistics offices, the environment ministries, and the national development planning commissions. But through this co-development process, we're really bringing together a number of key data providers, both global and national, as well as data users within these countries. And again, we really see an opportunity for this to fuel GeoBond's mandate, as well as the EO for EA and EO for SDG's mandate. Next slide. So what we're trying to do here is just transform the process by working with the art of the possible. So working directly with nations to build these toolkits. And we're seeing transformation happen at that scale. The challenge for us now is to work with GEO to really upscale and accelerate this process. Next slide. So the approach is one that's already underway. We have pilot incubators around the world, but we've chosen 3, Ghana, South Africa, and the Bahamas. And we like to work with GEO and the EO for SDG initiative to select 5 more countries and actually test the application of these toolkits in those countries before we upscale more broadly through the various GEO initiatives, including the regional initiatives. And the approach is one where we have user panels driven at the national scale, as well as a global steering committee to guide the process. And the final slide, please. So what we're really looking for here is we bring a lot to the table, but we are looking to upscale this. We need funding for a kickoff workshop, as well as country workshops, and to support further training and technical support. And we also have some data needs where we're actually augmenting and filling gaps with national data holdings with global Earth observation data products. We're really interested in HLS, for instance. And again, we're really looking for a partnership to bring GEO on board with this national toolkit approach. So thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Mike. Please include questions for Mike in the chat. And let's go to Heiko.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm going to talk about my pitch for an Earth observation toolkit for sustainable forests and biodiversity. Next slide, please. The problem is huge. We have looked at the extent of forest and how many people depend on it as part of the SDG development, of course, and 1.6 billion people depend on forests for their livelihood. Forests are home to more than 80% of all terrestrial species of animals, plants, and insects. And the world is still losing a vast amount of forest areas every year. Biodiversity is intricately linked to forests, of course. Forests are very biodiversity rich, and illicit poaching, trafficking of wildlife, and so on are posing a huge threat to the species diversity on the planet. Next slide, please. So the challenge is that we are losing about 48 football fields of forest every minute worldwide, and despite all the pledges to reduce deforestation, that has not happened in practice. And I appreciate those of you who are interested in football that you're missing the games between Slovakia and Spain and Sweden and Poland that are currently running on the television. So if you're following European football, much appreciated that you're tuning into my talk. Thank you. What we need is a much better information system in much more real-time mode for the forests worldwide. Next slide, please. The solution is currently the state of the art is a near real-time deforestation alert system that we developed in the University of Leicester from Sentinel 2 satellites that provides imagery every 5 days worldwide. and it is fully automated, machine learning based, change detection, and based on a free and open software package called PyEO, which is available on GitHub here. And it is implemented in organizations such as the Kenya Forest Service, with whom we've worked over the last 5 years. They have tested it on 2 pilot sites. We have concluded the pilot project now, and they want to scale it up to more areas in the country for improving the forest monitoring systems. This solution won the Copernicus Masters Award for Sustainable Living in 2017. Next slide, please. Just an example, this is an area of Colombia, Sentinel-2 image for one date, and the next slide is the next date. There's clearly some change going on in the way the algorithm works. If you go to the next slide, it produces a change map like this one, where we see in red the forest loss areas here that are very clearly identified from Sentinel-2. And what is really unique about this map is that actually we can also see some very small scale forest degradation happening at the 10-meter resolution imagery that Sentinel-2 provides. However, the information is currently still very coarse because it only provides forest cover loss, and clearly there is much more that we need to know about the forest processes. Next slide, please. The deforestation alerts can be transferred directly into Google Earth. So we see some white polygons of forest cover loss overlaid on Google Maps in this case here. And they can be used for navigating to the site, and they can also be used for very easy access to the deforestation information by the users. For example, on their mobile phones, but also on laptops. Next slide, please. On a mobile app, it looks like this. So when you click on one of these polygons, you get a window popping up that shows you the before and after image from Sentinel-2 with the polygon of the change area identified and some statistics about that area, like the area extent, the edge length, latitude, longitude, and so on. Next slide, please. What is also part of the system is that it can be linked to a big data analytics dashboard. So we can use other information as ancillary data. And for example, one could look at the types of forests that are being deforested in those areas. One could look at whether the forest disturbance is human-induced or whether it is a natural disturbance, such as fire or wind. And we can look at, for example, the frequency of disturbances, whether there was a previous fire and then a repeated fire over the same area. And users from the field can actually report information to this big data dashboard from their phones. So that enables, for example, the Kenya Forest Service that I mentioned earlier to go out into the field to check out one of the areas we have identified as forest cover loss and report back to the central office, to the GIS team. We've checked this out. Here's a photo of the site. This is actually a real deforestation and we need to investigate this. Or this is a wrong detection because of cloud cover, cloud shadow, or some other disturbance in the imagery. Next one, please. The ambition of the Earth Observation Toolkit is to go beyond the pilot study and the first operational use case we have in Kenya and develop this toolkit into an Earth Observation Toolkit that provides much more comprehensive information to support the monitoring of the Sustainable Development Goal 15, life on land. And here we want to provide this bullet point list of parameters. And like the forest area is a proportion of the total land area, which is cited in the SDG document as one of the things to monitor, with different spatial levels of aggregation and time series analysis, but also looking at the biodiversity of those sites and provide statistics of ecosystem types and estimates of the ecosystem services that they provide. So we have used our deforestation system to couple that with the INVEST ecosystem services model in Malaysia, for example, to look at habitat degradation on a weekly basis from the Sentinel-2 data and feeding the deforestation information directly into an ecosystem services model to provide continuous updates. And that higher level information really, I think, is what's needed to make this a toolkit that really helps mapping deforestation, afforestation, reforestation in much more detail, give us information on the forest types and the forest age that are being lost and being gained, on the success of replanting schemes, for example, on the fractional vegetation cover, and also on the rainfall anomalies that are prevalent in those areas. And part of the SDG 15 is, of course, the mountain ecosystem. So we could also specifically think about what can be done for mountains and provide a green cover index from Sentinel-2, for example, for mountainous areas to monitor those areas with more detail. I could see this link with databases such as GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, and the GeoBone network. Next slide, please.
1 minute, Heiko, please.
Thank you. The market size and uptake of this information is potentially huge. If we get this Earth Observation Toolkit right, then it could be used by forestry agencies, by community stakeholders, such as the community forestry associations in Kenya, who are involved in the design of that process, plantation owners, by green investors, and by the general public, for example, through schemes like the World Land Trust Buy an Acre scheme, where people can buy forest for purposes of forest protection. Next slide, please. The resources and the GEO support we are seeking, we need some technical support staff to develop, maintain, and update the Earth Observation Toolkit. We have access to free and open Earth observation data through Copernicus. We want to develop free and open software that can be used to make the Earth Observation Toolkit most widely used. And we want to talk to Esri and other companies about data hosting and archiving services, for example, on the cloud. And GEO can help us by networking with key players and bringing together a strong team. So next slide, please, and I will finish on this slide. So a further 380 football pitches of forests were cut down while I was talking. That's an astonishing number. So we need to clearly step up our efforts to protect the world's forest and biodiversity. And this toolkit that I'm proposing would enable an efficient monitoring towards the progress of the SDG 15 and increased transparency of the measures. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Heiko. Please add your questions for Heiko to the chat. And let's go to our next speech and speaker. Derek, over to you.
Okay, thank you, RG. Derek Fulmer from Conservation International, and I will dive right in. Next slide, please. So why a toolkit for freshwater health? It's very simple. By the UN's own estimation, we're already behind in meeting our water targets, which are enshrined within SDG 6. And despite the name, or the shorthand name, being clean water and sanitation, as some of you know, SDG 6 is fairly comprehensive in terms of the targets and in terms of addressing issues such as equity and management that are not necessarily amenable to Earth observations, but are of course important to meeting all of these targets. SDG 6 also includes one on ecosystems. And so as such, the report highlights that there's a need for localization and adaptation of these targets, these global targets, as well as the strategies to address them. The report also underscores that there's a continual need for more and better data to guide water resource management. And here I want to emphasize that it is a resource that is best managed at a more local scale, at a basin or catchment, and not necessarily at a national scale. Next slide, please. Coupling with that then, the second major issue that we seek to address with this toolkit for freshwater health is that although freshwater biodiversity is meant to be covered under targets of SDG 15, on the whole, freshwater biodiversity is doing far worse than even terrestrial biodiversity. It faces different threats and it requires different types of interventions. And moreover, it can't be addressed separately from interventions to promote human water security. So again, from a basin scale perspective, decision makers will need to continually manage trade-offs between human and ecosystem needs, and ideally find synergies through this focus on freshwater health. And so by using the freshwater health lens, we're trying to put together elements of SDG 6 and SDG 15. Next, please. So the Freshwater Health Index was designed to integrate this information at the basin scale. It combines measures of human benefits, the water supply, flood protection, recreation as some examples, with measures of ecological integrity. Now, when it's combined with survey data on the ground, it addresses all the targets of SDG 6 comprehensively. I haven't listed those here for you, But as I mentioned, it includes issues of governance and cooperation as well. It also addresses several targets in SDG 15, where we feel that freshwater ecosystems and biodiversity are underrepresented. There's understandably more attention on terrestrial and marine systems, and they tend to be easier to monitor from space as well. The key here, though, is connecting all of these dots, and rather than just measuring and reporting on the individual targets separately, as is kind of the common practice globally and in many countries. So those of us who work in water frequently say that SDG 6 underpins all other SDGs, right? You need water for just about everything. And while that's true on some level, we need to start by connecting the individual SDG 6 targets to one another and ensuring that those connections are made at the basin scale. So compared to terrestrial and marine resource management, Earth observations are just beginning to be leveraged in water resource management. So we're seeing great potential for this, but the full power of Earth observations are only going to be realized when it's part of a comprehensive framework and tailored to meet needs on the ground. Next, please. So who is the target audience for the Freshwater Health Index Toolkit? So since our unit of analysis for freshwater health is typically a river or a lake basin, a river basin organization or a lake basin organization or commission is the ideal target audience. That doesn't exist everywhere in the world, but of course there are a number of such organizations already in place or beginning to be formed. The challenge is that these sorts of organizations are typically coordinators. They're not necessarily decision makers. So it is also important to reach those who have actual influence over water resource management. In many countries, this may be a Ministry of Water or Environment or Natural Resources. Sometimes it's several ministries that need to come to the table who don't ordinarily talk to one another or work from the same data sets even. But they're making decisions that are traded off with goals of another agency. As I mentioned, though, water issues are often very local. And so we find it's typically pretty critical to be working with provincial and state governments as well, getting down closer to the basins where many key decisions are made. And so this is going to vary by country and by basin, but it's always a mix of stakeholder groups who need to be at the table participating and can benefit from these sorts of assessments. So we include in this group civil society organizations who can help in data collection, especially ground observations, as well as help in the communication or identifying some key community needs. And more recently, we've been working with companies on this too, who are recognizing the outsized role that they can play in promoting and protecting freshwater health. Next, please. So the Freshwater Health Index has been led by my group within Conservation International. We've been working on the development of the framework and the tool for about 5 years now. We've benefited greatly from a strong partnership with NASA. And they've really helped us make great progress in identifying the opportunities to leverage Earth observations data, as well as modeling to transform some of this into indicators that are even more relevant for water resource management. We have a number of supporting partners who work on elements of the regional implementation because we have been trialing this approach in basins all over the world, as well as working on improving some of the tools, as well as more recently doing outreach and capacity building. So I've got a list of some of our key partners who've really contributed materially, but so far with the applications around the world, we're up to dozens and dozens of people working with us to sort of expand this toolkit and its reach. Maybe one I'll just mention here that's a little bit newer is working with UNESCO and IHE Delft on a massive open online course on freshwater health. That's something that we're looking to debut this summer at World Water Week, and are really excited to open up the course for water resource management professionals to give them a crash course in the concept of freshwater health and how to use our existing tool. Next, please.
1 minute. Thank you, Derek.
So what can we achieve? Very simply, we want to reach more places in the world. Generating a global data set isn't necessarily going to help reach a bigger audience. What we want to be doing is getting down onto the ground, working with decision makers in many more basins around the world, getting to a country level and getting ministry level buy-in to using this toolkit to start managing water resources within their basins. And so that is the ambition to get to many more places that are facing some form of water insecurity. Next slide, please. So I'll wrap up here then. We are sort of coming out of phase 2 where we do have a desktop app. And so that's sort of the beginning, I would say, of our toolkit. And that has automated a lot of the processes for transforming data into indicators. Where we want to go in our next phase and where we could really use help from the GEO community is in transitioning to a centralized web app and providing much more in the form of decision support. What we want to do is shift from a more passive monitoring tool to an active and dynamic decision support system. Just earlier today, I heard a presentation on Earth observations for climate change and mosquito-borne disease monitoring. That's closely aligned with one of our indicators. And so that's just the latest example of what's possible with an expanded toolkit and support from the GEO community. Next slide, please. This is my last. And if you could just click through, there are a couple short animations here. Just to conclude, one more, I think. Our emphasis here is on getting stakeholders to be on the same page. And we like to say, paddling in the same direction. So it's not enough for one stakeholder to have an idea or a vision if the others are not contributing to that. So even if we have someone saying, yes, freshwater health is the way to go, we're not going to get there with one little person's hands paddling in the water. We need to bring on board the people who are really just tagging along and have them start contributing. We need to get alignment with people who maybe have another goal in mind. And we really need to pay attention to those who are sitting in the back of the boat, who really have the power and can steer us wherever they want to. So we've got to get everyone paddling in the same direction. And the Freshwater Health Index Toolkit is one of those ways that we can do that and get them all aligned on a vision for freshwater health. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. So please add your questions for Derek in the chat. And let's go to our last panelist for today. Dilek, over to you.
Hello all, thank you RG. Thanks to the whole team for giving us the opportunity to present our Citizen Science Toolkit idea for SDG 14 and SDG 15 today. Next slide, please. As we all know, the SDGs are an ambitious set of goals and targets covering social, environmental, economic issues to achieve a sustainable world for humanity by 2030. And again, as we know, and as we heard today a lot, the adoption of the SDG agenda established goals 14 and 15 for the protection of our oceans, seas, and ecosystems within them, and as well as for the conservation of terrestrial ecosystems and forests. And tracking progress on these two particular SDGs and others in a timely, accurate, and efficient way is essential to their successful delivery. But currently, 58% of the environmental SDG indicators, which includes the indicators of SDG 14 and 15, lack data according to UNEP. And only 1/3 of countries are on track to achieve their national target to integrate biodiversity into their national planning. And it's clear that national governments are central to monitoring and reporting on the SDGs, and the National Statistical Offices, or the NSOs, play a key role in data collection, coordination, and validation. But these NSOs are facing increasing demands for data from users, as well as declining budgets and rising costs for data collection. And all these planning and monitoring activities that we're talking about today can only be done if we have relevant, timely, and high quality data that are resource and time efficient, which traditional sources of data are not sufficient to address. And this increases interest in non-traditional sources of data, and citizen science being one of them. And very briefly define citizen science is the voluntary public participation in scientific research and knowledge production. And the potential of citizen science for SDG monitoring has been recognized in the last few years particularly. For example, UNEP included citizen science as a primary source of data in the global methodology of the SDG indicator 14.1.1b on marine litter. However, the NSOs and data and statistics communities are not really familiar with or do not have the capacity to identify high quality citizen science data and tools, and accordingly to use citizen science data to support their environmental decision making and actions. And this is a little bit different than the Earth observation data as we have been hearing today. So there is an urgent need to showcase such data sets and tools and use cases and success stories, particularly for citizen science, to demonstrate the value of it for SDG monitoring and implementation to the global data and statistics communities. Next slide, please. So why SDG 14 and 15 for citizen science and why now? This toolkit idea and the selected initial SDGs to have a focus on is actually based on a scientific paper published last year. And this study includes a systematic review of all the SDG indicators and citizen science initiatives at various scales to identify which citizen science initiatives could be supported or which SDG indicators could be supported through citizen science data. And you see the results on this figure. I will not go into details, but the main finding of this research was that citizen science data have the greatest potential to input environmental SDG indicators, and SDG 15 and 14 being among the most prominent ones. For example, according to our results, citizen science is informing 3 of the SDG 15 indicators and could inform 6 others. And additionally, 5 indicators in SDG 15 could benefit from the complementarity of citizen science and Earth observation approaches. And this figure also shows that the potential offered by citizen science data for SDG monitoring is far from being realized, while at the same time, 5 years into the SDG process, NSOs worldwide facing huge challenges to populate the SDG indicator framework, as I mentioned before. Next slide, please. So our SDG toolkit will demonstrate the value of citizen science data and impact for achieving the SDGs. And the toolkit will showcase citizen science data sets, tools, best practices, and resources, and promote their use by providing support to countries, initially for SDG 14 and 15, which will be extended later. Next slide, please. And the target audiences include DNSOs and governments, UN and other international agencies, relevant global initiatives, such as Paris 21 or the IAG SDGs, Interagency Expert Group on SDG Indicators, the GEO community, broader data and statistics communities, NGOs, grassroots communities, businesses, of course, and interested citizens, and citizen science practitioners and researchers. And the key contributors for at this point of time will be the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis and the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Thematic Research Network on Data and Statistics, SDSN Trends. And we, of course, expect contributions from the GEO Secretariat and EO for SDG, and also from the GEO Citizen Science Community activity that I'm a part of. And we plan to collaborate closely with other GEO flagships, initiatives that we've heard today, and also community activities such as the Blue Planet, GeoBone, and many others. Next slide, please. So if the toolkit is successful, high quality data, tools, case studies, and guidance to monitor indicators of SDG 14 and 15 will be available for official SDG monitoring and reporting purposes. And we will extend the activities of the toolkit to cover other SDGs in the near future, because as part of the research that I mentioned, we also identified that citizen science data have the potential to contribute to 33% of the SDG indicators across the whole SDG indicator framework. And there are already some very little, but some use cases and success stories that can showcase the use of citizen science data for official SDG monitoring, such as using citizen science to monitor marine litter in Ghana, which is a project carried out by IAZA, SDS, and Trends in collaboration with UNEP, Ghana Statistical Service, Ghana EPA, and Wilson Center, and many other colleagues and partners. And this was selected, actually, this project, to be featured as an impact story by Paris 21 initiative of the UN, World Bank, European Commission, OECD, IMF, and others. And we plan to implement more of these as part of this toolkit activity. And if the toolkit is successful, we also expect to see more countries with the capacity to monitor the indicators of SDG 15 and 14 and openly accept citizen science and other non-traditional sources of data within their SDG and other monitoring systems. Next slide, please.
1 minute, please, Dilek.
Sure. In terms of resources, at least at the start, we will operate through in-kind contributions from IAZA, SDS, and Trends, and from the network participants. And throughout the implementation of the activities, additional resources and funding will be sought through the networks of both SDS and Trends and IAZA, as well as the networks of participants. And we will aim to leverage existing capacities and focus on existing programs and funding schemes to streamline activities around the toolkit. And in terms of the support needed, administrative support from the GEO Secretariat or EO for SDGs would be very helpful, and additional support in the form of fundraising for the promotion, communication, dissemination, as well as the web portal of the toolkit would be highly appreciated. Next slide, please. And this is all from me. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dilek. And Laurent, over to you to moderate the discussion for the remainder of our time.
Yeah, thank you. Congratulations, everyone. I think it was really inspiring. I was really impressed by all fields you were able to look at. The first thing I wanted to say is that from a GEO Secretariat point of view, the fact that your proposal are taking in account the nexus between these SDGs are very important. The fact that they're all based on the GEO community, of course, it's a pleasure, and that's what we expected. Also, I found, RG, that it was very interesting, so that many of these proposals already have some pilots going on. So actually, it's a field that we see that is alive, and it's very good that we get organized, because we have seen this reporting burden that Mike was talking about, and we don't want a toolkit burden. So I think it's really good we get organized, and thank you, RG, for this proposal. So we had many questions in the chat. I think most of the questions were answered. So what I would really like to do is to open the floor with more questions. If anybody wants to ask a burning question, please do so. Raise your hand. Before that, I'd like to ask to all panelists what are they considering now that they listen to the other proposals. Maybe it makes some more brainstorm about two things. What would be the greatest challenge to implement this toolkit proposal, and how, now looking at the other proposal, they would think about integrating more collaboration, more co-design at the beginning? Because I've seen some proposals where you are really mature already in what you want to provide, but how could you change this to co-design it with the GEO community? You know, this is always a big problem. It's hard to have some clean toolkit. We have seen this, you know, these tools that are all around, and this toolkit very clean. How can we co-design your really useful toolkit? So I'd like to ask each of you, starting from Emily, to quickly answer these two questions. What are the biggest challenge, and how would you imagine to organize this co-designing of the toolkit? Starting with Emily, and for the last 5 minutes, I will open the floor to everybody for last question. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you, Laurent. So I'd say for the biggest question, a lot of the challenges that come up when it comes to developing these toolkits are maintaining them. So it seems fairly easy to get funding to do a pilot demonstration. And as we've seen, there are a lot of great efforts ongoing. But I think one thing that the GEO community needs to do to come together for sustainability is to figure out how to have an infrastructure for these toolkits that's sustainable, and for funding organizations to understand that to keep these data sets up to date, to update the methods and other information, it does take ongoing work to keep them updated. As far as integrating across GEO, I think if we could have some type of common infrastructure to build these toolkits, it would be extremely helpful. It would help us from reinventing the wheel, as well as to try to keep some of the overhead down. There are a lot of external parties who have tools that could be integrated into these toolkits. So I think getting the message out is something that GEO also could work with together. And as we've seen, and I think every presentation touched on this, if we really want to reach the SDGs, we need to stop looking at them in silos and looking at interlinkages between them. So if we could have linked toolkits, that would be very helpful.
Thank you, Emily. It was a brilliant answer. Mike, you presented this weeks of 6 extension and cookbook solution. How, I mean, this is burning question, so it's even harder. What's the challenge to answer to such a big challenge, and how do you see we can co-design it with the GEO community? Please, Mike.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the biggest challenge we have is one of upscaling, I would say. It's simply because we are kind of working in a co-development process. I've been guilty as anybody of trying to take shortcuts in the past where we create global data products and we disaggregate them to national scales and we hope they stick. But what we're finding is they don't. People don't use them. They're not locally valid. So we're kind of taking a bottom-up approach, which is more effective and has more sustainability in terms of building the capacity within the country, but then has the challenge of that upscaling. Like, we can't be in 100 and 200 countries all at once. How do we do this? And I would say that problem is across the board. What we've been talking about within GeoBond is trying to team up with the idea around these regional synthesis sensors. So right now, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is talking about establishing regional nodes. They're actually perhaps embedded within UN Environment Regional Centers already. There's a lot of sort of regional bodies out there that we can kind of find those synergies to deliver and support the training and the capacity building. And I think that aligns really well with things like the GEO regional initiatives, such as AfriGeos and AmeriGeos. So I think we have to find those sort of synergies, and I think they're there. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. I will now give us to Heiko about forest. Heiko, so you want to tackle a very difficult issue of this deforestation that is going on that we were never able to stop. So how can you imagine that how this toolkit could change the way that what's happening now, and what is the main challenge to actually succeed in this task? Please, Heiko.
Thank you, Laurent. Yes, well, how could this toolkit change things? I think we can make things much more transparent. So far, we are very much focusing on deforestation statistics, and those data are now available in many countries and worldwide. You know, we have Global Forest Watch and similar initiatives, and some nations have made great progress. But what we don't know really is where those deforestation events are happening, what types of forests are being lost, how high the biodiversity content of those forests was. Are they going to be able to regrow? Are they actually replanted? Or what is happening? How much of this is part of rotation forestry and how much of it is part of destruction of primary habitat? So where this toolkit can make a big impact, I think, is by highlighting some of those issues where the deforestation is happening and what the impact of the deforestation is on biodiversity and other ecosystem services. That's the first point. The second point I want to raise is really the collaboration and partnership issue. And here I think there's a tension between countries wanting to have autonomy over the forest management policies and monitoring mechanisms and reporting under the UN RED initiative, for example. And we have seen this in Kenya, where we have worked with the Kenyan government over the last 5 years or so in order to implement that monitoring system in the Kenya Forest Service. And you know, they have full autonomy over how they apply it, and it is their system now. We've co-developed it with them from the start. But to get towards a global EO toolkit on sustainable forests and biodiversity, what we need to do, we need to go beyond the nation states. So how do we actually provide a toolkit that nation states can implement in their own agencies, where they feel like they have control over the resources and over the data and the information that they produce, but equally there is some transparency to the international community. There is this tension about how open different governments want to be about what's happening in their forest land.
Thanks so much, Heiko. And I don't know if you heard the thunderstorm going on here in Geneva, but it's a good transition for Derek on freshwater. And we will lead. Archie, can we have late 2 or 3 minutes? Is it any problem for the GEO Symposium?
Not that I'm aware of, but I would suggest that we'll continue with brief remarks from our.
Okay. So Derek and then Dilek, can you please answer very quickly to these challenges and these co-design opportunities? Derek first, thanks.
Sure. The biggest challenge, like Mike's, I think, is upscaling now. We made the commitment to really develop a tool that works at a basin scale, but there are thousands and thousands of basins. So now we're turning our attention to regional and global partners who can help us identify where there's real demand and then getting the tool in their hands. In terms of an opportunity for co-design, we're talking to GeoGlows and AquaWatch, and so we're becoming more aware of some of these tools and approaches that we think can fit within the toolkit. Challenges maybe the bandwidth of any of those contributors. The flip side of that is maybe helping to nudge some of the GEO participating organizations to go beyond monitoring, because we can't simply take stock of what we know is in decline. Things have to change. And so we want to use the tools of Earth observation and modeling to be able to plan better and to look towards the future, especially in light of climate change, which we know is really going to disrupt water systems around the world.
Yeah, I can confirm this from Geneva. Now, Dilek, please, on this citizen science, together with Earth observation, what are the challenges and how the GEO community can join in this initiative, please?
Thank you, Laura. In terms of the challenge, actually, I'm just going to answer and it's a little bit differently, look at it from a different perspective about the challenges in terms of citizen science. So an important challenge is about the uptake of citizen science data for official SDG monitoring purposes, is sometimes citizen science data, as we know, is considered as having a little bit of a less quality than authoritative data sources. But this is exactly what we want to address with this toolkit. So to break down these barriers related to data quality in citizen science. And we have a real clear plan and strategy to document and assess data quality in citizen science, which includes probably developing code of practice. And also we want to develop a set of criteria for identifying high quality data sets and tools that could be used for official SDG monitoring and reporting. And while developing that, we will of course have a look at the SDG 11 toolkit experience, as well as SDGs today of SDSN trends and many others. And in terms of the co-design within the GEO, or how can we co-design, I think citizen science, at the heart of citizen science, there is the co-design. So, and when I heard all these presentations today, I see that citizen science could be really in the center of all of it, could contribute to all of it, and could benefit from all these toolkits. So I think it's really important within the GEO community, with the support of GEO community, we realize these ideas. Thank you.
Fantastic, Dick. Thanks so much. I'll ask Archie to close the symposium to announce the next session.
Okay, thank you very much, Laurent. I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank the audience. And just to let everybody know that, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have a second session with additional panelists that will present their toolkit ideas next Wednesday, June 30th. We will have an announcement go out from the GEO Secretariat, as well as the EU4SDG initiative. So please look out for those details and connect next Wednesday as well. Our plan is to then have a discussion and look at what has been presented between EU4SDG and the GEO Secretariat and the panelists here and their initiatives, and determine the best way to help move some of these ideas forward. So with that, I'm going to end here today. Again, thanks very much to everyone for your great contributions. Thank you.